and say, let's allow certain protocols to be used here from a voluntary perspective, and that's why you see VCS being used. We're seeing CAR protocols being brought up into Ontario to be adopted, not necessarily in the forestry space, but we see that movement happening now. So we're a little late to the table, but it's beginning to happen. What are the WCI compliance standards? The Western Climate Initiative, which is California, BC, Ontario, Quebec, maybe Arizona, maybe a few other states and provinces. Well, the first ones we're seeing are potentially climate action reserve modifications. So we think those will be fungible or grandfathered into the WCI scheme. And quite frankly, we think we'll see perhaps some VCS standards adopted and adapted, and maybe even things like FCOP. You know, certainly it's been developed with an eye towards representing BC, but where it goes from here is yet to be seen. Very dynamic space at the moment. What are the issues that we have with forestry? And you hear about these quite often. The issue of additionality, and this is a carbon issue in general. But certainly with the project, the question is, would the project have happened in the absence of revenue from carbon credits? So what you have to look at across the board with any type of carbon project is whether or not in a business as usual case a project would have occurred. Quite frankly, when you look at restoration projects in the forestry space, because of that issue with money being spent upfront and being perhaps returned over a much longer period of time, it's a much simpler test to pass, because quite frankly, nobody would do a restoration project if carbon revenues weren't part of it, unless it's a completely philanthropic endeavor. So what we've seen historically are a lot of groups, a lot of philanthropic organizations invest in restoration because it's the right thing to do. Carbon can play a role in that. We haven't quite figured out, most people haven't quite figured out beyond selling these tons ex ante how that's going to work, but that is one of the issues that's out there. So for most of these forest projects, what are you competing against? Well, you're competing against fiber revenues. So if it's more financially rewarding to actually cut down trees and log to a certain extent, you're not going to do a carbon project, or in most cases you wouldn't. But if carbon could be competitive with that price of fiber or timber, would you in turn keep that forest standing? Perhaps you would. So that's one of the big tests you have to pass, and it doesn't matter what kind of project, forestry or not. Permanence, that's always a huge one. With forests, as you know, and look what's happening up in northern Alberta right now, forests can, in certain circumstances, reverse. And that means either through forest or pine beetle or disease or extreme weather event, something could happen with that standing forest, and we could see a reversal in the carbon that has either been sequestered or is projected to be sequestered. There are many ways to deal with that without getting too far into it, but most of the protocols ensure that you build in a number of different buffers, and they look at leakage risk, they look at permanence risk, and specifically to the bioclimatic region and the history of the area you're developing the project. And you do have to set aside a significant buffer, which is tons that are created or stored there which are not monetizable in the markets. So should there be a reversal of some sort, then there's this buffer reserve that makes up for that reversal. VCS takes it a step further, the Verified Carbon Standard, where they have a global buffer pool. You see this with Carbon Fix and some other protocols. It's a global buffer pool between all the projects that have been developed under that protocol. And in case there's a reversal in one specific circumstance or two, there's a huge pool there that would buffer or ensure those reversals. So in the case that there's a massive cataclysmic event where all of these projects are somehow reversed, well, then you'd have a problem. But quite frankly, that's not necessarily the case, and I don't think it'll ever be the case because most of these protocols are so robust now that really you're only talking about a fraction of the carbon that is available for sale that ends up being out there in the marketplace. So we always err on the side of caution. There are also in this industry insurance mechanisms being developed by other protocol developers and of course the insurance industry. We see this happening in Australia and a couple other places, South Africa, where perhaps down the road we'll actually see insurance opportunities where you can actually attach those to tons that have been produced. Forestry, for example, is one of the companies that do that. Leakage. This is a huge issue, especially in the forestry space. So leakage is this concept of emissions increasing in one area because you've done a project in a different area. So if I own 1,000 hectares and I decide to go from logging 10,000 cubic meters a year to 0, is my neighbor going to increase his logging 10,000 cubic meters a year to make up for my shortfall? It's a very difficult issue to deal with. There's a number of algorithm and numbers that are used to determine what leakage rates would be on a project scale, on a provincial scale, on a national scale, and work will continue to be done on that. So going through this process, you have to be able to determine what your leakage rate would be, and that gets, that number actually, or percentage is incurred into the overall number, which again comes off your bottom line. So your ability to sell, your gross tons is obviously netted down based on that leakage value. This is an issue certainly with forestry and agriculture, and it's not 100% dealt with. There's always going to be debate on what that number is going to be. But what we see happening in the marketplace is certainly at a regional, provincial, and federal level, and this is across a number of jurisdictions. There is work being done to determine those values, and I know here in BC, PwC, PricewaterhouseCoopers, was actually hired to do a leakage assessment for the province of BC, and I think you'll see that happen across certainly Canada, certainly being done across the United States, and being done in a number of developing countries, so we can actually assess a more appropriate value. Accounting, how does the developer ensure the carbon volumes are correct? Again, we put a lot of that stress on the project verifiers and validators. These protocols and methodologies are certainly, they have a script thrown off them when they're being developed. The important factor here is to realize that most definitely it's an evolving marketplace. If you can't trust that a ton is a ton is a ton, there will not be any uptake in the marketplace. So the validation and verification have to be robust enough to support the assertions that you're making from an accounting point of view. First Nations considerations, these are huge. The biggest is land title. Who owns the land? Is it Crown land? Is it owned by the First Nations group? We personally have a lot of experience in dealing with this. There's a handful of First Nations here in BC that actually own their land, and for them it's quite a bit easier to actually produce projects. It gets a lot more complicated when you're dealing with Crown land, and this is a national issue. BC is in the process of allocating carbon rights as one of the fiber rights. We see a lot of work being done, certainly provincially and federally, at acknowledging that there's additional values on forested land besides the timber. And I think what we'll see happen within the next couple of years is an acknowledgement, not just at a pilot level, but at a national level, that fiber rights will include carbon and allow, whether it's through a community forest or a local forest, to monetize carbon just as you would fiber. So it's exciting. I think this is one of the most exciting things that most people should get their head wrapped around. Carbon rights, who owns and controls the carbon on the land, and this goes into, I think this goes into the land title. It's one thing to own parts of the trees, but it's another thing to own the carbon that comes from it. It's one of the issues we have to deal with in the forefront is how do we allocate carbon rights so the end buyer, whether it's voluntary or compliant, can actually own those carbon rights and retire them or use them accordingly. Baselines, we're still trying to develop project-level baselines, provincial-level baselines, and federal-level baselines. What's our overall forestry baseline within this country? Let's start, what is it at the province level, and how do we ensure that the projects we're doing are additional to what normal operating baseline would be. Socioeconomic issues, another big one. How does this fit in with overall current First Nations policy and land management practices? There's a whole lot of good that can come out of this, but how does it fit into the overall picture, and the discussions are happening within the First Nations level, certainly at the provincial and federal level as well. From an economic point of view, let's talk about markets. What market do you want to play in? what is the value of that market, and of course,